this event today. I'm so very pleased to be, we here at the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs are so very pleased to be co-hosting today's event with the Stimson Centre. It's a unique opportunity, I think, to listen to the views of one of the most respected thinkers on nuclear weapons issues in the country, and certainly one of the best bloggers on nuclear weapons issues in the country. Michael Crepon, former arms controller, co-founder of the Stimson Centre, recipient of the Carnegie Endowments Award for Lifetime Achievement in Non-Governmental Work to Reduce Nuclear Dangers, and of course, prolific author, is joining us today to discuss his latest book, Winning and Losing the Nuclear Peace, The Rise and Demise and Revival of Arms Control. In our field, it is always important to remember the hard-won lessons of arms control, non-proliferation and disarmament, but even more so in the current circumstances. And those circumstances also compel us to look to the future and what measures will be needed to prevent the use of nuclear weapons and to ensure their total elimination. I'm going to start with a few housekeeping issues that I think we should all be familiar with now after the last 2 years. Please keep your screens and microphones off. We will be having a question and answer session at the end of today's event. If you would like to ask a question, and I do encourage you to do so, please enter it into the Q&A function. And if you can, make sure to identify yourself and your organization in doing so. It's now my pleasure to introduce Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, United Nations High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, to make some introductory remarks on behalf of the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs. Izumi, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to co-host today's event with the Stimson Centre. Obviously, Stim Centre is one of our very important partners for UNODA. Now, for decades, Michael Crepon has been one of the foremost thinkers on arms control, non-proliferation, and nuclear disarmament. We all know that. And he has also been a solid ally of the United Nations in our multilateral efforts to pursue a safer and more secure world. So I'm going to start with my sincere thanks to him at the beginning of this event. Top of our shared list of priorities is the need to preserve the hard-won norms against the use, proliferation, and testing of nuclear weapons. These essential norms are vital to ensuring human, national, and collective security. And in light of the current geostrategic conditions, preservation of these norms has become really an urgent task. And we don't need to even mention that. We can just only watch the CNN and BBC news stories and images. Now, winning and losing the nuclear peace is an outstanding insight into one of the most underrepresented aspects of the history of the Cold War. We are all aware of the close calls and near misses. We need to be more aware of the men and women who worked tirelessly to prevent them tipping over into actual use, and who achieved some of the most important diplomatic successes of the era. These were achievements that significantly reduced the risk of nuclear weapons being used and took great strides towards their total elimination. They were not easy, and many backward steps were taken, but perseverance paid off. This is, I think, perhaps the most important aspect of Michael's book, that it illustrates the difficult lessons learned when dealing with an entirely new type of weapon and one with a potential to exterminate life on Earth. The fact that those lessons were learned without, as Michael would say, mushroom clouds appearing on the battlefield is remarkable. Unfortunately, I fear we have forgotten many of those difficult lessons. A simple glance at a headline today can point to how acute nuclear risks have become. We, as an international society, must not forget. We need to relearn the lessons of arms control for a new era and prevent catastrophe. Now, to begin with, we need to re-educate the world not only about the catastrophic potential of nuclear weapons, but their prospects for use. And we must especially inform the world's young people, those who will inherit tomorrow, but can be a force for change today. That is why I am so glad we have with us today one of the United Nations Youth Champions for Disarmament. I am very much looking forward to the exchange between Dylan and Michael, the eminence Greece, if you will, and up and comer, the veteran and the Rocky. This kind of knowledge transition, this opportunity for young people to not only listen to, but also question experienced thinkers is something that we should do more of, I think. I hope all the other young people in the audience will avail themselves of the opportunity to ask Michael a question or two. Now, before we move on to the interesting part of the event, I wanted to conclude by welcoming Michael's advocacy for, as outlined in his book, New Thinking and New Approaches to Arms Control. This deals with Secretary General Guterres' own thinking on the matter. It is why he has called for a new agenda for peace that places disarmament at its center. And it is why he wants a new vision for arms control that seeks to maintain the great gains of the past while addressing, of course, the new challenges of the present. Now, thank you very much, Michael, for being with us today, and thank you for your tireless efforts in our shared course. And I look forward to a robust discussion. Thank you. Back to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Azumi. And with that, I'm going to give the floor, as it were, to our distinguished guest, Michael Crepon, to say a few words. Michael, over to you.
Chris, thank you. Madam Undersecretary General, I do appreciate your hard labor. You mentioned the word perseverance. That word is so important right now. We've been through some hard times in the past, and we've gotten through them. And I think we can get through this hard time also. It's going to take a lot of work, and I know the UN is so critically important to the notion of rebuilding that which we have lost. The UN was founded. The very first lines of the UN Charter talk about prevention of war. And that's the purpose why all these great institutions were built after the Second World War. Prevention of war. All of our work cannot be pursued if aggressive war becomes part of geopolitics. And I think we can get past this. There are going to be some tight corners, but I think we'll be in a position to rebuild. And I think the UN will be a very important part of the rebuild and in strengthening norms. So with that, I'm interested in what Dylan has to say.
Thanks, Michael. And indeed, on that, I'm going to hand the reins over to Ms. Dilan Koch. Dilan is one of UNODA's outstanding disarmament champions. She's currently a Fulbright scholar pursuing her master's at the Yale University Jackson Institute of Global Affairs, and I'm sure she has some great questions for you. Michael, over to you, Dilan.
Thank you so much, Chris. Michael, it's an honor and pleasure to be speaking with you today. I want to thank you so much for your time. And as Ms. Nakamitsu kindly stated, I'm so glad that I have this opportunity to ask you questions and further learn from you. And actually, I want to jump right into questions as I have so many of them. So I wanted to start with, you write that the story of arms control is not told in books about deterrence, of which there is no shortage. And with your book, Winning and Losing the Nuclear Peace, The Rise, Demise, and Revival of Arms Control, which is the first of its kind, you say that you repay a debt. So I wanted to start by asking, why do you think arms control has been excluded from these stories? And what is the central message of your book?
You know, I don't have a good answer why the history of arms control, nuclear arms control in particular, has been so elusive. I think it's because specific chapters have been more interesting than the whole history. So we have great books about crucial turning points and crucial negotiations. But I felt there was a need to write a book that pulls all of these chapters together. Because I firmly believe that we become more effective change agents the more we know about our past. So that's one reason why I wrote the book. Another reason I wrote the book is because deterrence has hogged the spotlight. And deterrence is so dangerous. And it's purposefully dangerous. Otherwise, it doesn't deter. If I want to deter you, I need to threaten you. And deterrence alone has not kept the nuclear peace. It's a part of it. But because it's so dangerous, we need arms control as well. We need norms. We need the pursuit of disarmament to go along with deterrence. Because deterrence without reassurance, provided by arms control, is very likely to lead to mushroom clouds. So I'm trying to give rising talent like you, Dylan, a sense of how crucial arms control, reassurance, and the pursuit of disarmament is. Because otherwise, deterrence is just too dangerous.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for this book and your work in the field that guide all of us. And I want to pivot to my next question, that what is the central message of your book? What should be the main takeaway that the readers or the audience right now should take away from your book?
Well, one of the central messages is not to lose heart. If you read the history, one thing that's very striking is that we've had some extremely dark passages, and we're in one right now. And that's not the end of the story. Our leaders have employed diplomacy to get us through dark passages. And every close call we've had has resulted in new diplomatic effort to reduce nuclear danger. And it always seems to be darkest before the dawn. I mean, things were truly dark. Late in the Eisenhower administration and early in the Kennedy administration, there were nuclear tests on average. In 1958 and in 1961, once every 2 weeks. Can you imagine? And a lot of those tests were in the atmosphere. And then we had a limited test ban treaty after the hair-raising experiences of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The first administration of Ronald Reagan, especially when he was paired with Andropov as the General Secretary of the Communist Party, oh my God. We nearly had a war in 1983 and we didn't realize it. How bad is that? And then in the second Reagan administration, when a series of very old Soviet leaders were replaced by a new leader, we had the most amazing treaty that came of that dark period. And I want you to believe, and I want your colleagues to believe, that we can turn this around again. Of course, we have to get through this dark period first without a mushroom cloud. But I think we will, and I think we can. And then new opportunities will arise.
On that point, you led me into another question. As you just stated, and you write in your book that nuclear peace can't count only on deterrence or on arms control, but it has to embrace both of them together. So the first question is, how fragile is nuclear peace right now, you think? And the other question is that, do you think divisions are widening between those who believe nuclear weapons provide security and those who demand nuclear disarmament? And how can those divisions be narrowed? And how can those groups work better together?
The nuclear peace is always threatened the most in severe crises. Those are the hardest times to maintain the norm, the most essential norm that we live by, which is the norm that you don't use nuclear weapons in warfare. That Nagasaki was the last one. And we've managed to succeed at this, despite severe crises and accidents and close calls for 3/4 of a century. And I propose in this book that we aim to extend this norm of no use for a century after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I think we can achieve this because this is the hardest norm to break. It's the hardest norm for any national leader to break after 3/4 of a century of non-use. We've got that going for us in this war in Ukraine. But we have to remind Mr. Putin and everybody else that any leader who breaks this norm, no mushroom clouds, any leader that breaks that norm will become absolutely reviled for the remainder of human history. So to the second part of your question, which is so hard, how do we work together to do this? People who believe deeply in nuclear deterrence and people who believe deeply in arms control and disarmament. Right now in my country, we have tremendous political divisions. They're so great that it's hard to conceive of new treaties getting through the Senate with a necessary 67 senators in support if a Democratic president offers the treaty. So I think there's a way, and I propose it in the book. I think what deterrence strategists and arms controllers and those who believe in disarmament, what we can all agree on is we don't want mushroom clouds. We may disagree on how best to do that, but we can all agree on extending the norm of non-battlefield use of nuclear weapons day by day until we reach the 100th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We can agree on that. I don't know anybody in my country who really looks forward to a mushroom cloud. We don't. And in support of that norm, there's a very important corollary norm, which is no testing of nuclear weapons. Because every test of a nuclear weapon is like a declaration of military utility. And that's not what we want. We want the exact opposite. And I propose that we extend the norm of not testing to the 100th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as well. So Dylan, I want you, and I want people in the audience to try to use your imaginations. I want you to try and think of a world in 2045 where nuclear weapons have not been used in warfare for a century. And I want you to imagine a world in which major powers and regional powers haven't tested nuclear weapons for, say, 40 odd years. What would that world look like? How useful would nuclear weapons be? How central would they be in the defense plans and budget allocations of different states? So what I'm proposing in effect, Dylan, is that we achieve extraordinary results through small steps every day. Every day without a mushroom cloud, every day without a nuclear test. That's a successful day. And rather than hit our heads against walls where we're not successful, and by the way, I also propose that as part of the perseverance practice. But seriously, we can change the world one day at a time.
Thank you so much for that. So about those nuclear weapon norms, we mentioned no use, no testing, and non-proliferation. And you also mentioned no threat of use in your book. And so non-proliferation is codified in the NPT, and on testing, we have CTBT, which is not enforced. So I wanted to ask, can no use and no threat of use be included in arms control treaties or multilateral processes? Any thoughts on that?
Well, there's also a very important treaty, the Prohibition Treaty, which establishes these norms, reaffirms the NPT norm of abstinence, and that's an important document as well. But I came of age, Dylan, when treaties were everything. And treaties remain important. The treaties we still have are absolutely crucial, because we got two more that we haven't talked about that establish norms against possession, development, production, and use of chemical weapons and biological weapons. Those are foundational norms. The non-proliferation norm is a foundational norm. But the world I grew up in revolved around treaties and numbers. And that world is hard for me to envision, at least in the near future. So that's another reason why I'm focusing more and more on norms right now. Because if we hold fast to the norms, there will come a time when we can go back to nuclear arms control arrangements among major powers and include China in this business as well. But I think that pursuit will be around norms rather than around numbers. I'm not excluding numbers, but I think it starts around norms. And the norm of not threatening use matters. We want to stigmatize nuclear weapons. We do. We want to stigmatize their use. And if we want to stigmatize their use, then we want to stigmatize threats to use. So I think it's incumbent on us when anybody threatens to use nuclear weapons, we call that leader out, because that threat constitutes a crime against humanity. And that ain't right.
This led me into another question, which is that, so what role do you see for the non-nuclear weapon states to extend and contribute to the nuclear peace, especially in light of emerging non-nuclear strategic capabilities and new domains in cyber and outer space?
Yeah. There's a lot of talk right now, Dylan, about all these new dangerous technologies. And I respect those concerns and I share them. But again, I think the history can help us, because there are chapters in this book I wrote where advances in military technologies were way, way more profound than they are now. The advent of a missile that could put satellites in space and that could also be used to send a nuclear warhead halfway around the world in 15 minutes. That was a revolution in military technology. The advent of hydrogen weapons. Oh my God, with unlimited destructive power. That was a revolution in military technology. The advent of nuclear-powered, quiet submarines that could carry these ballistic missiles. That was a revolution in military technology. The advent of MIRVs, multiple, independently targeted reentry vehicles, so I could stuff a missile with 6 or 8 or 10 or more warheads. That was a revolution in military technology. All of these revolutions of military technology in my opinion, were way more profound and dangerous than the ones we worry about today. So yes, we can worry about artificial intelligence and cyber warfare for sure, and space warfare. But please remember, we have survived previous revolutions in military technology that I believe were even more profound. How do we do this? I think we do it through codes of conduct because treaties are so hard to do. We do it by codes of conduct that clarify two things: responsible behavior and irresponsible behavior. If the problem of technology that we're facing doesn't lend itself to a fabulous treaty that disregards geopolitical rivalry, then we can pursue it by means of a code of conduct. For space, for cyber, the UN's active in this. It's very important work.
Thank you so much. Since we're getting short on time, I wanted to ask about Ukraine that you just mentioned. So what do you think the impact of the recent events in Ukraine will have on arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament?
Neha, please, Neha, I'm sorry. I'm looking at Neha's message. Dylan. This is another area where history can help us. Because so many people have said, oh my God, this is the death of arms control. Whatever triggered it. Oh, it's over now. This is just terrible. I have heard this so many times in my lifetime. I'm 75 years old. I've heard this so many times. Death to arms control. This is the final stake in the corpus of arms control. Please don't go there. Arms control revives because the world is too dangerous without it. And leaders don't want to live in a world in which nuclear danger continues to rise. Neither do the people they serve. And even autocrats serve. So this is not the death of arms control. Ukraine is not the death of arms control. But I will grant you that a great deal rests on how this war ends. First of all, it has to end without a mushroom cloud. It has to, and I think it will. But I can't be totally sure of that. And so you and I, in my view, arguing the case against nuclear use in Ukraine matters. It matters greatly because we take nothing for granted. If aggressive war pays, aggressive war against a country that gave back its nuclear arsenal to the aggressor, a country that received security assurances from the aggressor. If aggressive war pays, then I will grant you we're in a much deeper hole to dig out of, to revive arms control. If aggressive war does not pay, and aggressive war turns into a losing stalemate for the aggressor, we have a foundation on which to rebuild.
Thank you so much. Following up on that, you write in your book that public safety requires public engagement. And right now, the general public seems to be rediscovering nuclear dangers with the Ukraine crisis. So I wanted to ask, how can we engage with the public without horrifying them about the dangers of nuclear weapons? And how and a follow-up question to that is, how can we increase public awareness and participation in decision-making on these issues, especially for young people?
Oh, I think I take one of the best parts of my work has always been connecting with rising talent. Rising talent gives me hope. And there are other things that give me hope as well, but I feed off of rising talent. I am so sustained by young people who commit themselves to this field. And I see them. They're all over Washington. And perseverance, there's that word again. There's that word again. It's so crucial. Because if you enter this field, you're going to take hits. It's a given. And so then you have to pick yourself back up and to remain committed. And our greatest successes have been accompanied by public engagement. President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev and Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, would not have signed a limited test ban treaty ending atmospheric testing without public insistence. You've got to stop doing this stuff. It's dangerous to us. Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev couldn't have broken the back of the nuclear arms race in the Cold War without massive public insistence. You've got to stop doing these things. They're dangerous. Take control of this problem. And regrettably, it takes dark times to re-engage our public on our issues because there's so many other things to worry about in our daily lives. So I get that. But I do think there will be a resurgence of public interest. And especially because the nuclear set of issues is so intertwined with the environmental set of issues. You can't separate the two. And I do see a resurgence of young talent coming. I see a wonderful cohort of teachers in academia, at least in the United States, that are committed to teaching this issue. So, as I said earlier, it's always darkest before the dawn. And I think new opportunities will come. But it's going to be up to your generation, Ilan, to carry this ball.
Yeah, on that point, since we are almost at the end of our time, I wanted to end with a special question for myself as a UN Youth Champion for Disarmament. So I wanted to ask, what would be your message to the young professionals and youth interested in these issues who want to contribute to arms control norms and policies aimed at reducing nuclear dangers?
I would say thank God for your idealism. Because we need it. And thank God for your interest. The field is in need. We are in need of your talent. We are in need of your commitment. There is a long line of, generations have gotten us here through dint of hard effort. There have been setbacks, many setbacks, but here we are. 3/4 of a century after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, here we are. Nuclear arsenals among the big two have been reduced by 85%. There was a time when the Cold War ended, when all of the key elements of nuclear peace were in place. And that took the labor of generations to accomplish. No use, the cessation of testing, the cessation of dangerous military practices, the number of threats to use nuclear weapons way down, the reconfiguration of nuclear forces, respect for the territorial integrity and national sovereignty of other states. All of these key elements were in place when the Cold War ended, and then came a series of very bad decisions. Parts, significant parts, of this edifice of arms control that was built by previous generations was torn down. But we still have a foundation on which to rebuild. And the new building's going to look a little bit different than the old building. It'll have some common elements. We still have important treaties in place, even if they haven't been ratified and entered into force. We still have these crucial norms. And these are central pillars of reconstruction. So it's going to be the task of your generation, Dylan, to help with the rebuilding. That's going to be your job.
I hope we can do a good job.
I think you can.
Thank you so much, Michael. It was wonderful speaking with you. And you're an inspiration for us young people, the students of arms control, who want to contribute to this field. I wanted to thank you so much for your time today, and I want to hand it over to Chris. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much. Thank you, Dylan, for moderating that. Thank you, Michael, for some very interesting replies and very interesting questions. I would take a sip of water now if I was you, because we have some more interesting questions that were about to come your way from the Q&A. A reminder, if you do want to ask a question, please do enter it using the Q&A function. I've seen some very familiar names in the questions thus far. So just a reminder that if you are and I don't know how you would categorize this, a younger person out there, this is your opportunity to ask a question of Michael, and we would really like to hear from you. It's kind of one of the purposes of today. But if you're ready, Michael, I'm going to kick things off. Yep. Okay, so the first question I have comes from Deb Sawyer of the Utah Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And Deb wants to know, if NATO were to become nuclear weapon free with Russian inspection, could that help Russia to move out of Ukraine?
Diplomacy requires carrots and sticks. And some of the most amazing feats in arms control and disarmament came as a result of the sticks. So this treaty we've been talking about between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, it was the only nuclear disarmament treaty of the Cold War. And it required Washington and Moscow to stop producing and to verifiably dismantle missiles, cruise missiles and ballistic missiles based on land that carried nuclear warheads. Now, this treaty came about because NATO agreed, 5 NATO countries agreed to deploy these missiles because the Soviet Union had already started. So NATO, 5 NATO countries, the alliance as a whole, agreed to retaliate in kind with these deployments. And these were very dangerous missiles, extremely dangerous missiles. They could destroy Moscow in, I don't know, 10 minutes, less than 10 minutes. And Moscow couldn't have seen them coming in. I mean, talk about nuclear danger. And yet the deployment of these missiles prompted Mikhail Gorbachev and the Soviet General Staff to get rid of theirs. And both countries abolished these weapons. Now, I'm not suggesting that deploying supremely dangerous nuclear weapons is a great idea for anybody. But I do acknowledge the history. In this instance, we couldn't have got a great outcome without doing something dangerous. I think my personal view about Ukraine is that it's crucial that we prove to Vladimir Putin and anybody else who is inclined to wage an aggressive war and to violate the territorial integrity and national sovereignty of a weaker state. That's not acceptable behavior. And I do believe that as a consequence, it requires military, economic, and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. To clarify, this is not a winning strategy. And if we can clarify that aggressive war doesn't pay, then we can rebuild arms control and the pursuit of disarmament.
Thanks very much, Michael. I think quite a few of these, it would be unsurprising to you that quite a few of these questions relate to the current circumstances in Ukraine. And so the second question I have now is a two-parter from Sai Krishna. And Sai wants to know, how will the Ukraine war impact further nuclear peace efforts as smaller countries will see nuclear weapons as a trump card, and I'm quoting here, against international bullies? And then the second part of that question is, can the TPNW be a stepping stone for future international peace and nuclear disarmament?
Well, I think as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that what's called hedging strategies are likely to grow. So a hedging strategy is a strategy by a state that isn't convinced that it's wise to actually have nuclear weapons, but it is wise to be in a position to acquire them if the need does arise. So hedging strategies, I think, are going to grow as a result of this war, and especially in the Middle East, because we also are looking at an advanced Iranian nuclear program that stops short of nuclear weapons. That itself is a hedging strategy. So I think this is a negative consequence of the war in Ukraine. But it doesn't mean that states will then move toward actually crossing the threshold in terms of actual acquisition. It does mean we have to work harder to shore up the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the Prohibition Treaty does that. It does shore up the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But as I've indicated, I think the best strategy to progressively reducing nuclear danger and heading to the ultimate goal of disarmament is a strategy of daily success. Daily success in preventing use and daily success without nuclear testing.
All right, thank you. Our next question comes from Eric James, and his question relates to what can you say regarding the proliferation of smaller or so-called tactical nuclear weapons, and particularly in regards to the risk that they could be used in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict? And secondly, the second part of that question is, how can the use of these weapons, which seem to be designed to lower the threshold for nuclear war, be prevented?
My view is that the best counter to tactical nuclear weapons, well, there are many, but one of the best counters of tactical nuclear weapons is to argue against a lowering of the threshold. We take on deterrence strategists frontally on this matter. I don't care what the yield of your weapon is. I don't care the range of the delivery vehicle for a nuclear weapon. I don't care how great the mushroom cloud is. No use. No use. It's simple. You don't detonate a nuclear weapon in warfare, regardless of its size and its packaging. And for many parts of the world, I'm thinking of South Asia in particular, there's no difference between a tactical and a strategic nuclear weapon. Range doesn't matter. What matters is that you cross a border. Short range, long range doesn't matter. And we hammer away at this. No use, regardless of yield in range. And I think we have military arguments to back us up. One of the reasons why tactical nuclear weapons haven't been used in 3/4 of a century is because they are harmful to military operations. They get in the way of nuclear offensives. You're not good for soldiers in the field, your own soldiers in the field. They're not good for tanks and armored personnel carriers either. Not to mention that there is likely to be retaliation in kind. So I know that some deterrent strategists just have lost themselves in the utility of tactical nuclear weapons. But I think we have stronger arguments, and I suggest we use them.
Okay, thank you. I should at this point say that if I mispronounce your name in reading the questions, I do apologize to our participants. I should also state very clearly here that we do have a wide spectrum of questions from across different positions in the arms control, deterrence and disarmament communities, and that none of these questions being read is an endorsement by the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs or the in asking those questions. And with that in mind, I'm going to go to a question from former Ambassador Alfredo Labe, who I believe is also a Stimson non-resident fellow in Santiago, Chile. He congratulates you on your book. He wants to go back to the NPT's preamble and Article 6, and he says that, prospects for nuclear disarmament are set against general and complete disarmament, a once widely embraced construct predicated on the need to readjust security to new paradigms such as cooperative security and today human security. He says, don't you think there is a great need to reactivate the quest for GCD in order to accommodate the security interests of everyone at the lowest possible level of armaments, such as DEVA is for all members of the international community, not just nuclear weapon states?
I absolutely believe in the linkage of Article 6. Unreservedly. But I also absolutely respect the hard spaces of geopolitics. So one of the reasons why I am so focused on norms for now, well, I'm going to be focused on norms forever, but why I think they deserve some kind of prioritization now is because treaty making is so difficult. And trilateral treaty making, which is the heart of the pursuit of Article 6. Trilateral treaty making relative to numbers has never been successful. Multilateral approaches have been tried in between the two world wars, and there were more than 3 parties, and they were numbers based. They had to do with tonnages of capital ships. And it failed. It failed because of the geopolitical ambition of 2 states between the wars. And the geopolitical ambition of Russia under Vladimir Putin does not currently lend itself to the pursuit of general and complete disarmament. Now, I mean, Putin is not a reliable partner anymore in the pursuit of arms control and arms reductions. And we have a whole different set of problems in bringing Xi Jinping into this equation. So I'm puzzling over how hard this is for now, while looking for daylight. And it does lead me to a small, incremental, daily victory type approach. Now, if for whatever reason, Vladimir Putin stands aside and new Russian leadership emerges, and I don't know how, and I'm not saying this is likely, but I would only note that leadership change in Moscow has been conducive to the limited test ban treaty, has been conducive to the initial strategic arms control agreements, has been conducive to this INF treaty that we've been talking about. And so I don't discount the possibility of leadership change in Moscow, opening up a door toward a more ambitious approach. But for now, I think we make headway, and we can make surprising headway through daily victories.
Thank you. I think if anyone's interested in the concept of general and complete disarmament, if you want to go to UNODA's website, we do have some interesting material on that too. It is, as Ambassador Labe said, quite the forgotten concept, but is actually intriguingly having a bit of a revival at the moment. I'm going to move now to a question from Himachandra Basappa, and they're not the only person to have asked this question. There's a few along these lines in the Q&A, which is that, was NATO necessary after the disintegration of the Warsaw Pact? And could NATO's actions over the last 30 years be seen as provocative?
This is such a huge debate in my country right now. And people are coming out of the woodwork saying, oh, you see what Putin's doing? We were totally right in expanding NATO. My own views on this subject, I find them evolving over time. During the Clinton administration, when his second term, when NATO first started to expand, small steps, Hungary, Czech Republic, Poland, just 3. The heart of Europe. The Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration argued, his name was William Perry, and he argued that we ought to take a long time before even going there to the first 3. And he proposed something called a partnership for peace, in which the Eastern European space and the Baltics would become tied to the West through a variety of mechanisms, obviously through trade, economics, but also in the military dimension through military exercises, a special relationship to NATO, and offering Russia itself a special relationship to NATO. So Bill Perry argued this, and he had no help. He had no support. And once the door of, I thought that was a pretty interesting idea myself. And once the door of NATO expansion opened, it was hard to tell people, it was hard to stop. It was hard to tell countries, no, I'm sorry. This is okay for your neighbor, but it's not okay for you. And the George W. Bush administration just rushed through this open door and invited 7 states to join right away. And these states included the Baltic states. So obviously you now have a flashing yellow light to Vladimir Putin. And then in 2007, George W. Bush started to entertain the thought to extend invitations as well to Georgia and to Ukraine. And lo and behold, that's the period of time when Putin goes to Munich at the Security Conference and basically reads the Riot Act. Says, I can't do business with the West anymore. You have no sense of my sensitivities. And that's when independent, I'm using quotation marks, enclaves in Georgia happen. The Russian army marches on Tbilisi. And then, of course, after a pro-Russian kleptocratic government is shown the door in Ukraine, that's when Crimea is annexed, and these so-called independent enclaves are created in eastern Ukraine. So here's where I'm at now. Clearly, getting NATO to agree in reluctant principle to invite Ukraine and Georgia into the queue for NATO membership at Bucharest in 2008 was a really bad decision. And that there were other ways to cement Ukraine and Georgian interest in the West rather than bowing east. I think that was clearly a mistake on the Bush administration's part. But given Putin's behavior, I'm okay with NATO expansion below Ukraine. Well, no, I shouldn't say that. I'm okay with NATO expansion. I think we went too far. Let me put it at that, leave it at that.
All right, thanks, Michael. Next question is from Ambassador Susan Burke. She says that there is concern about the impact of the current situation in Ukraine on the non-proliferation regime in general and the NPT in particular. She says, what is your view on this and your advice to the keepers of the non-proliferation regime? And if I could add to that, just from my own perspective, what's the impact going to be on the 10th NPT review conference coming up in August?
Well, you should ask that question to Susan. She has real world experience in this, as does a good friend of mine, Lewis Dunn, who managed the NPT review conference with Susan's help during the Reagan administration. And, you know, when the world is behaving badly, it's not a good time to weaken the NPT regime. It's not a good time at all. When we worry about the proliferation consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you know, it's not good to increase fissures within the regime. So I'm holding out the hope that the review conference, members of the review conference will be very deeply aware of their responsibilities. We got to hold fast. We can't rebuild through additional teardowns. So obviously the trashing of the security assurances given to Ukraine in 1994 is unhelpful to the NPT regime. And the invasion of Ukraine is deeply unhelpful to the NPT regime. We don't fix this problem by weakening the regime further at a review conference.
All right. Thank you. Next question is from Douglas Rocha, who is a research fellow at the Institute for Strategic and Defense Studies in Lyon, France. And he says, considering the deadlock in arms control between the United States and Russia, how can other nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states contribute to arms control? Is multilateralization possible in arms control?
You know, I think the multilateralization of norms is not only possible, it's already happened with respect to no testing. Where I do think we can make further progress, as I've noted, is with codes of conduct, and their non-nuclear states and nuclear armed states, I think, can work together. But we need a realistic agenda. And the pursuit of unverifiable treaties that have glaring omissions is not the way to go. I do think norm building is the way to go for the space and cyber domains. And I do think the most unexplored space for multilateral efforts among non-nuclear and nuclear possessor states deals with threat making. I think there it's up to the non-nuclear weapon states to take the lead. They've abstained voluntarily. Okay, in return for our abstention, stop making threats to use these weapons. It's an area worth exploring, in my view. It'll add pressure, and pressure is useful on nuclear armed states. We need pressure. But I think the pressure points have to be chosen carefully at a time of great geopolitical competition.
Well, here's an interesting add-on to that question then, and it comes from Marguerite Gordonier, who is a student at McGill University, program coordinator for IPPNW. And she wants to know, is the threat of nuclear use barred by the NPT in the same way the use of nuclear weapons is? And can current threats regarding the use of nuclear weapons actually be considered under the norms of the NPT?
So here I'm going to need help, and I may be saying something incorrect. But I believe the only treaty that expressly bars nuclear threats is the Prohibition Treaty. I do not believe that the Non-Proliferation Treaty expressly bans nuclear threats. I think that is inherent in the NPT, but I do not believe it's expressly stated.
Thanks. And then just to build on some of the other answers that the questions that we've had again, I got one from M. Munoz and one from Brian Fury. And the first one is, what do you think of strategic risk reduction and other intermediate suggested steps towards nuclear disarmament? And what does nuclear disarmament really mean today? And then it says here, how do we revive meaningful arms control, including compliance with existing treaty obligations? So the CWC, the BWC, the CFE, CTBT, all of the existing arms control agreements or disarmament and non-proliferation agreements.
Those are two important questions. Let me start with the latter one. Treaties do not have enforcement mechanisms. The treaties we live by today do not have enforcement mechanisms. Now, there was an enforcement mechanism back in the day after World War I. Germany was demilitarized and forced to pay significant sums of money to other countries in Europe that suffered from Germany's aggressive war in World War I. And there were actually Europeans who were placed on German soil. The victors placed inspectors on German soil, and they tried to monitor and enforce German disarmament. This did not end well. Germany was bankrupted. There was a popular revolt against its subjected status. German rearmament began and accelerated in a very big way. And the grievances resulting from enforcement led to World War II. So that's just historical background. And perhaps one of the reasons why no treaty negotiated in our space has had enforcement provisions. A second reason is that any enforcement would have to go through the United Nations Security Council, in which permanent members hold a veto. So what treaties have done instead is, if you have a compliance concern, you take the issue, you take the matter to the UN, to the Security Council. There are also ways to take a matter to the UN General Assembly. And you can provide pressure. You can embarrass. And all of that's very important for issues of non-compliance. Tremendously important. But you can't compel a state to do anything unless you want to resort to the force of arms, which is hard to do if the state in non-compliance also possesses nuclear weapons. Now, one of the oddities of the Trump administration in the United States is that they proposed that any future treaty be enforceable. That's a new wrinkle. I don't think this one has legs. But we'll see what a future Republican administration has to say on this matter. But compliance doesn't have enforcement attached to it. So it's crucial for us to call out non-compliance when it happens. When a state employs chemical weapons, when chemical weapons are used as an instrument of assassination, we call them out. Every treaty regime that I'm aware of has outliners. They come with the regime. The goal of the regime is to isolate outliers. It's to clarify unacceptable behavior by outliers. Without norms, there are no norm breakers. So this is a tremendously important function of the treaties we have left. And we have to clear our throats as needed. What does disarmament mean today? That's such a great question. I think disarmament means what it has always meant. It means that we aim for a world without weapons whose use constitutes crimes against humanity, crimes against nature. We keep in mind the end state. We can seek the end state by many different methods. But disarmament still means having one less nuclear weapon as opposed to one more nuclear weapon. And we still aim for this. Now, as I've said, the techniques, we have to be adaptable, flexible, savvy in our use of techniques. And there are going to be times when we don't make progress using any technique. But we're not going to forget the end state. And we're not going to give up.
Thanks, Michael. I know we've only got 5 minutes left, but I was hoping we could squeeze in 2 questions. Because I think they're 2 really good questions. This one, first one comes from Kyle Sally, which is specifically for younger professionals. What lessons can be learned from our forebears who lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis and found meaningful ways to work with their Russian counterparts in the succeeding decades? How can younger professionals in the United States, for example, rebuild trust with their counterparts in Russia to ensure future dialogues on arms control? And I think that is a question that actually is broader than just the US and Russia. I think if you look across the multilateral system today, there's an absence of trust across all of the issues we deal with when it comes to nuclear weapons. And I think that is going to be a significant challenge for young diplomats and arms controllers going forward, how to rebuild that trust.
It's going to be really hard to rebuild trust as long as Putin is in charge of Russia. I say that with the deepest sorrow. But he won't always be in charge of Russia. Something that was so important to me when I was a young professional was traveling to the Soviet Union and engaging in dialogues with my counterparts. Oh my God, I learned so much. And I had a chance to visit so many different places, including Kyiv, and Moldova, and Chisinau, as it was known then. Obviously, the historic Russian cities, Moscow, St. Petersburg, just amazing. Getting a feel for the depth of Russian art and culture and the intelligentsia in Russia is amazing. And of course, butting heads over talking points. But visiting Russians, my cohort, and having them visit here in return and hosting them here in return. Oh my God, that was so important to me. And it's crucial for these track 2 young professional conversations to resume. I know it's going to be hard to do in the near term, but it will be essential to do over time. The most crucial lesson that I've learned is the need to remain committed. You're gonna have periods of depression, and you need to find mechanisms to get you through those periods. For me, nature is essential, and family is essential. When your work is depressing, you have to have outlets, but persevere, because the darkness will lift. It will. The history of arms control and the pursuit of disarmament is replete with backsliding. But then people, committed people, talented people, make progress. We have come such a long way. I like to remind my audiences that since 1945, 125,000 nuclear weapons have been manufactured. You know, just an astounding number. Not one of them have been used so far in warfare. That's just amazing. That didn't just happen because of deterrence, I'll tell you what. It didn't just happen because of plain blind luck or divine intervention, although I'm not discounting any of that, any of the above. It happened because really good people worked this problem. Good people at the United Nations. Good people in governments. Citizens taking to the street. Committed people. It's you know, when I was in my 30s and 40s, there were still 30,000 of these weapons around. Still. Now there are 13,000 or so. That's a huge number. A troubling number. But look how much progress has been made by people who have worked this problem. So, carry on. Help us out.
Awesome. Well, we're over time already, so I think we'll leave that right there on those very wise words. You heard Michael. It's important to have outlets. Go and hug your family, and if you can't hug your family, hug a tree. Go back to nature. I want to say thank you very much, Michael, for taking the time to join us today. It's been a very interesting conversation. We live in very interesting times, which I know is a curse, but you know, we will grapple with them. I want to say thank you to Dilan Kosh. Thank you to our friends at the Stimson Center. You know, this has been a great event. And again, I think the details for Michael's book are in the chat. If you want to find more about the book, and it is a great history of how we got here and how we can not backslide going forward. I'm sure it's available at good bookstores. Do they have good bookstores anymore? I don't know, but it's definitely on Amazon, right? So in the meantime, again, thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, and I hope that you all have a great day.